Hey everyone, Ashley Easter here. I'm your host of the Courage 365 show, and I'm so glad that you have decided to join us today. We are streaming every Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern, and you can also catch the back episodes of Courage 365 on our website, courage365.org/videos. We have a really important show for you tonight, something that is going to be really essential to you as a survivor and to you as an advocate. These are important conversations to have. And on the show, I am going to invite Alexis Douglas to join us. Hey, Alexis, how are you?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, absolutely. And everybody, if you have not caught the last episode that we had with Alexis, it is going to be so vital for you to go back and watch that episode. And what I want to tell you about my work with Alexis, she is an amazing woman. She is doing so many amazing things in the world. And she talks about having hard conversations, which are important here with Courage 365, the Courage Conversation Show. I just want to give you a little bit about the vision and mission of what we are working towards here at Courage 365. So, we're taking the next steps to learn and grow in our support of the BIPOC, that means Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, community within the survivor community. We are so excited to introduce that Alexis Douglas, the founder of Actively Authentic Ally Program, is here to help us have those conversations. She's here to help us grow in this area. We realize that there's a lot of us white people here and we've got work to do. And if we ever want to end abuse for everyone, we really have to address this topic as well. So we're going to be talking about the intersection of race and the intersection, how it intersects with abuse and just so many other super important things. Now, white people who are tuning in, I know sometimes this conversation can feel scary, but guess what? It's an important conversation to have. And if we really want to end abuse, which has pretty much been our tagline for a long time, this is an important step in that path. So I want you to tune in, I want you to pay close attention. And what we've done is we've actually taken some questions based on our community discussions, and we're going to be addressing some of those today. So, Alexis, without further ado, I just want to go ahead and start this show. Thanks for allowing me to have a little bit of a long intro, but I want to be able to bring it over to you to start the conversation. So thanks for hanging in. uh,
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you for that impassioned call to action. And I do want to say, I know that the conversations are scary, but the thing to do is not run away from your fears.
yes.
Like we have to be courageous in the face of our fears if we want to end the cycle of abuse. Um, so last time we talked about resilience and remembering
Mm,
as a part of what Black people have to go through in order to exist in US America, and in order to begin to heal. And so this week we're going to be talking about reparation and restitution, or reparations as a form of restitution for the impact of racial harm on Black people. Um, and I want to talk about it from a sense of financial abuse. We get a lot of, and we're not short on evidence of physical abuse and actual torture, but we don't hear as much about the financial abuse that goes along with it. And so I sent to Ashley to put in the comments an article called by Ta-Nehisi Coates called "The Case for Reparations," and it outlines, just based on Jim Crow laws, a case for reparations. So often when you hear about reparations, resistance that comes up around it is that enslavement was, 200, ended 250 years ago. So, and don't do your math on those numbers if you all know what year that it was. 18, let's
I'm
just say
dyslexic, so I'm no help.
1865. No, we'll say it's 1865 because that was when all Black people knew they were free. Although then that lets me know it was 1863 when slavery was actually abolished. But everybody, soldiers who were in the Union still fighting to keep their way of life, which their way of life was enslavement. Um, they didn't tell their human trafficking victims that they were free until 1865. So, but Jim Crow laws ended in 1964, and the Voting Rights Act happened in 1965, and the Fair Housing Act happened in 1968. So what those laws had to be the voting, because black people had to have voting rights, and in order to be able to establish positions of equality in the legislature or in the governing bodies, because we didn't get citizenship until the 14th Amendment to
Mm.
the Constitution. And so, and then from there, it was immediately attacked. So the thing that often, every advancement that was made for Black people, there's always a backlash that begins to pick it apart and tear it apart and pull all the fabric out of it. And so Jim Crow laws would prohibit Black people from being able to vote unless they own property. But then there would be districting done by like banks and mortgages where there would be certain areas, the Black areas, where they would not um, lend to Black people in order to buy property. And so we were prevented from establishing home ownership, and home ownership is one of the most common ways generational wealth is passed on. Um, a thing that I want to make sure that we draw attention to is the fact that I said that Jim Crow laws ended in 1964, which was 57 years ago. My father, who's right in the next room, is 72 or 3,
Wow.
which means that the person who reared me was alive during times where there were colors only and whites only fountains. That is the psychological, his psychological landscape for what he thought, the way he thought the world worked, is what shaped my view. But if he's that close and that's what shaped my view, that also means that 57 years ago is when it became illegal to discriminate against Black people. And we all know that if our parents have influenced our thoughts, so like that's my father, my mother, they've influenced the way I see the world. That is the same for white people. So if there were overt racists fighting to keep the Jim Crow laws 57 years ago, do you think that they were going to be sore losers or happy losers?
Good point.
Are they going to teach their children equality because the law says so, or are going to teach their children that the law is stupid? So when I'm bringing this up because often, so financial abuse is was defined as the illegal or improper use of a vulnerable person or their financial resources for another's profit or advantage. Some examples of financial abuse may include the taking of money or property, forging a signature, getting a person to sign a deed or will of power of attorney through deception, coercion or undue influence, or illegally or improperly adding names to bank account, safety deposit box, etc. But what about when it's legal and sanctioned by the government? Does
Mm.
that not make it abuse?
Mm.
Or the president recently spoke about the Tulsa race riots, and that was 100 years ago. So Jim Crow laws were still in action during that time. But even in that oppressive system, was Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was the Black Wall Street, where people were able to establish and build generational wealth. And then in one day, there was a race massacre, and no one was held accountable.
Mm.
No one. It was called a race upbringing or something like. It was like described in the newspaper as a race riot, not a massacre.
Wow.
And No one, so that, and there are descendants alive still as of that were present and escaped and fled, but a whole town's economy demolished. Those descendants lived, the people who survived lived in poverty. There was no abuse restoration from that. There was no reparation for the harm done. Insurance companies didn't pay.
Mm,
It's just you lose everything, and if you don't do better, you'll die.
wow. Wow.
So I am coming, I am advocating for reparations because my father was born in 1948, my mother in 1951, not my fifth generation, not five generations ago, not all that. And I grew up in abject poverty.
Right.
There were things like, so I'm affected, I'm currently affected by the impact of these things. And I'm reading a book by, I can't, it's called Bridges Out of Poverty. And I know that Dr. Ruby Payne is a contributing author, but there are unspoken rules of class
Yeah.
that keep you from being able to get out of poverty without a mentor, without someone to be able to help you bridge your way up. And I've had those things, and it is still, as soon as something comes along and knocks the bottom out, there, fortunately now in my late 30s, I have established, I own a home,
Mm-hmm.
but it took a while to get there. And even still, if there certain things could happen, and if I were prevented from getting a job or something like that due to racism, which I have experienced, and it's not as easy as now it is because jobs are abundant, but before the pandemic they weren't. So it's not as
Mm-hmm.
easy just to go get another job.
Right.
I could still lose my house, but that won't be the case. Um, and I maybe took it too personal, but there are underfunded public schools in Black areas. There are families who don't own a single thing and don't even know about the concept of ownership because of intergenerational poverty, but families were not able to do anything about it because of all of the restrictive laws. And I may not have said it very eloquently, but please do read that case for reparations
Yeah.
because it is a wonderfully well thought out. It's a longer article, but it is a good read just to give you tangible understanding through policy and how those policies were enacted
Mm,
in individual citizens of the United States with no recourse, without regard to any impact on the lives or the generations after.
mm. Wow. Wow, that is so important. And I think that the ways you've worded things really has brought this to our community in a light that they can easily or more easily understand. So instead of using the term slavery at one point, you used the term human trafficking. And that's what it was. And I think sometimes we use different lingo when it has to do with what people of color have suffered to distance ourselves from the reality of what happened. And so I really thank you for bringing that in more modern terminology because we have survivors in our community who have experienced human trafficking. I know that is a thing that has happened. People are talking about more widely these days, but that's really what slavery was. It was human trafficking. And so I appreciate you kind of bringing that to mind. And then some of the things you're talking about as far as, not owning things, not having access to your own property, and having these generational traumas happening that not only impact the body, not only impact mental health, but also impact somebody's financial security. When I think of that, it reminds me, it's not the same, but it reminds me of what a lot of abuse survivors in our community have gone through, where, particularly in domestic violence situations, there may be the one partner who keeps the house in their name. who is the only one who has the credit cards, is the one who doles out the money or not. I've had survivors who have talked about, how they literally did not have access to their own funds, whether or not they were allowed to work or not. And when that happens, it's very difficult for them to leave that abusive environment. There's not a lot of safe places to go when you don't have finances to help you get there. And so when we zoom out and look at not just an individual domestic violence situation or cult situation, because a lot of times it's the same scenario in cults, but a whole people group who have had financial abuse, as you rightly called it, happening to them, sanctioned by law for many, many years, of course, that is going to have ripple effects. And I think that kind of brings me to another question, which is, I think a lot of times in the survivor community, in spaces that maybe are mainly white, there can be this, talk about, well, it's more difficult for people of color, and that's just kind of like just said, but there's no like backing up that statement. And I think this financial abuse, as you've talked about, is a big issue. But could you kind of maybe talk about that a little bit with us? This is a question pulled from our community. What is the difference between, a white person going through an abusive situation, domestic violence, sexual abuse, cults, that kind of thing, and a black, brown, indigenous person of color? Why is that, why are there layers? How are the layers impacting here?
Well, if you think of it, I the easiest way to put it is it's an additional layer that is societally encompassed, right? Like
Mm,
society is that layer. And what that looks like is, so whether you believe it to be murder or qualified immunity for a police officer murdering black people, the imagery we see is that black people get murdered by the police.
right,
So if I'm escaping domestic violence, I don't feel necessarily safe running to the police or bringing the police to my home, to my presence, because it's not a guarantee that I'm going to be seen as a victim. And
right.
therefore, and it's also not a guarantee that my victimhood, even if I am seen as a victim, will be not something else to be exploited.
Mm,
Because as we know, people who are real villains definitely exploit the more vulnerable.
yes,
Um, if I if the road is harder for a black person to build financial security and they're escaping a domestic violence situation where someone had, or in a cult or any of the other forms of abuse that you name,
mm,
their ability to recover is
mm,
diminished
right,
because there are even less safe spaces and less people who value their existence.
yeah,
Um, and if the just as if the abuse, like sometimes you get PTSD and someone who looks like your abuser could cause a flashback.
right,
If you suffered racial abuse, like there you cannot escape. There's not very many places to go where there are not white people.
right,
And
yeah,
if they're in, unless they are areas where, because of that redlining practice where of not lending and corralling black people into a ghetto, there is in abject poverty, there's violence and scarcity and all the things, because lack makes you grumpy
right,
at best,
yeah,
right?
exactly, yeah,
So the difference I could say is that reparation or the ability to be restored after. The I'm not saying healing is easy because it is not. Um,
mm,
it's not for anyone.
mm,
But just I don't like saying it this way, so please y'all give me some grace. If we look at things like a continuum or like a spectrum,
yeah,
privilege, white privilege also applies to abuse survivors
yeah,
in that same correlation, like black abuse survivors. So like it's just going to be easier for you to get resources. It's going to people are white tears cause massacres.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
they move people, and
Right.
black emotion is seen as angry
Mm,
or impassioned or playing the race card or
right.
delegitimized in some way.
Yeah. And I think a lot of our survivors have experienced that themselves. But if anybody listening can put on a different lens, and if you have reported your abuse and you've gotten a negative reaction, that is not being delegitimized that your experience was negative. But imagine that being put on steroids because you're a person of color. So you can have really shitty experiences as a white survivor, and also a person of color is probably going to have even a harder time getting the help and support and the belief that they deserve.
Also, there are different implicit bias or different stereotypes, and
Yes.
the Jezebel or the highly sexualized nymphomaniac is a trope of black women, and
Right.
the bucking bull is a trope of black men. And so, in terms of sexual abuse, the same like how do I put when we go to the doctors, doctors don't believe we can feel pain because
Mm-hmm.
of US's history of inflicting pain and us being resilient. So it's not
Right.
that we can't feel it, it's just that we've been abused so much and didn't die.
Right.
Um in terms of sexual abuse, subtle behaviors are more sexualized in an implicit bias kind of way. So my friendliness may be seen as more of a sexual in more of a
Mm,
sexual way, which then can send mixed signals. And I'm not, please understand, I'm not defending, but if you've been indoctrinated with the programming of TV and the media and
mhm.
history books, and then you have some epigenetic history. And what I mean by that is you have some ancestors that maybe they had a propensity for um, sexual enjoyment without consent. That history will make my smile be an invitation.
Mm,
Like it is, I don't know, like I'm sure a lot of the survivors in your group have, especially the people born as women, as female, were understand what I'm talking about, where it's like you're talking to someone and they can't see any or hear anything but their intention or their
yeah.
arousal and desire. And it's like, I regret saying hello to you now.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And sometimes that goes along with the armor that you'll see like women have too, because
Hmm.
it is a risk to be friendly.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I know in my experience, when I had really long hair, just having long hair, I got hit on way more. And when I cut my hair, for some reason, it didn't fit into the same stereotypes that I had been placed in before. But that's something I could change about myself if I wanted. I can't change the color of my skin. You can't change the color of your skin. And so, you know, we shouldn't we shouldn't have to change ourselves. But there are people who place certain ways of being that are just who we are as, oh, that automatically means sexual invitation when it's not. Yeah.
I mean, I can think of this is a smaller, like say you're working out and then you want to go for a walk with your friend.
Mm-hmm.
If you keep your workout clothes on and you're walking around your neighborhood, you're gonna get all kind of stares or
Mm-hmm.
invitations for more, and it's kind of it would had nothing to do with that.
Right.
Like the fact that you have to remember to cover up and
Mm-hmm.
dirty another set of clothes,
Yep.
like that invitation, those things, that bias that people have and carry, just make it the more layers that is just like the more intense the abuse and abuse healing journey are.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. No, that's really, really helpful. Do you have any other thoughts around this or around the reparations piece before we move
Um,
on?
no, I just want to advocate for reparations. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah,
What it looks like, we are still looking to agree upon, but the more people who are on board with it, the easier it is to get something.
yeah,
Um, and it is necessary because 57 years ago, like
mm,
that's not that old. I don't consider 57 to be old.
no, yeah,
No, it's an age I look forward to getting to, and
hmm,
it's but 57 years.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's a should be an easy concept for survivors to grasp because many times what we're calling for, whether we're talking about sexual abuse that happened in the church or happened in, whether it's the gymnastics arena or, Boy Scouts, whatever, when you experience trauma and then nobody's there to pay your therapy bills, like you deserve someone to take care of the harm that it cost you. Many survivors don't receive that. And so we fight for those things. We fight for monetary reparations for what happened to survivors of abuse and domestic violence, sexual abuse. And so it's really the same type of thing when survivors of racism, which is abuse, are asking for reparations for the harm that has been caused and placed upon them for generations. And so, yeah, I think that concept makes a lot of sense. And I feel like hopefully our audience can kind of see that connection of when harm's done, you can't fix what hurt the person physically, internally, emotionally, mentally. But what we do have in our society is currency, and that can be used to help give the person back a little bit of what was lost. And um, yeah.
What I think it honestly, what I think a modern version of reparations would look like is I would want reservations or a portion of land like the First Nation people got
Mm-hmm.
because they suffered genocide and
Yeah.
atrocities against their people, and we were imported because enslaving them didn't work because
Mm-hmm.
they knew the land so well.
Right.
um I think that that's fair because when I look at the time frame of Reconstruction, which is after the abolishment of slavery, there were
Mm.
federal troops in place to keep white terrorism from happening. And and they were there for 20 years. And this is when you saw towns being established, businesses, farming, like
Right.
a era of prosperity um, for Black people. And then as soon as the federal troops were gone, the white terrorism began because of the resentment of seeing Black people do well.
Right.
And white people, just period, if Black people are doing well, they must be doing wrong or must be doing
Mm-hmm.
worse.
Yeah.
Um, so I just, if we got land, we could build
Yeah.
our own futures.
Yeah.
And I believe that. So when I'm trying to formulate my course, and I keep getting stuck on what liberation actually feels like.
Mm.
And it's because everything is in comparison to an established white dominated society and trying
Yeah.
to retrofit liberation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying I want to like be separate from the United States.
Sure.
This is the only land I know.
Right.
But I do want the space to not have to think about race.
Sure.
And that's a privilege that white people get that Black people just do not. And we can't, it's hard to know what we can create on our
Mm.
own
Right.
because all of our cultural influence gets absorbed into white dominated society.
Yes. Yes. Wow. Ugh. You give me so much to think about every time we talk, things that I haven't seen from that perspective before. new things that I'm learning, and I know that our audience is learning right along with me. This is so, so powerful. Yeah, so I think that that's really helpful to understand. Thank you for sharing. I want to move into our next two questions. And again, I have pulled these questions based on some of the conversations that have been happening within the Courage 365 community. And in the future, everybody, we would love for you to submit questions. And hopefully, you can see how we're having this dialogue and we're addressing these things. And this will kind of give you the courage to submit some of these questions. But the
And
next
just so
one,
you know, I get them anonymously. So I
yes,
don't know who said what. I don't know the demographics or anything. So please do ask your curious questions.
yes, yes, that's yes, absolutely. So our next question is I keep hearing the term white fragility or fragile whiteness. What does that mean?
So that is a term coined by Robin DiAngelo, who is she's a white woman, but she was mentored and coached on racism and critical race theory by tons of black mentors. And it's the defensive reaction that
Mm,
white people have when their racial worldviews are challenged. If they perceive themselves as having pulled themselves up or made them, be self-made or overcome some great struggle, it's hard to see that privilege may exist. So any if you find yourself being white and we're talking about race and you want to defend your goodness,
mm,
chances are you're entering the zone of white fragility. And white fragility could look a few different ways. It could be when you hear things like, oh, why are they always playing the race card? Because our society, this is a history lesson, but our society
mm,
literally was built on race and racist
right,
construct. So
exactly.
it always plays the race card, which is why the race card is always on the table. If we were to take
Uh,
the racism out of society, then the race card would not always be on the table. But
right.
because the table laid out the race card, we're just saying, hey, look at that card.
Yes.
Um,
Wow, that was like a mind blowing moment. Black and brown people are not playing the race card. The race card's already there. They're just pointing to it.
the
Yes,
race
thank
card is
you.
playing them. Okay, and we're saying, hey, stop playing us.
Yes. Wow. Wow.
So, but then also, what'll happen in the face of discomfort with the information and cognitive dissonance between not being able to refute the facts before you,
Mm,
often feelings of guilt or shame will come up.
yeah.
And if you are a more emotional person, then you might have tears come out.
Mm,
And in that moment, because tears are a signal of hurt or pain, people tend to focus more on the tears than the racism or the situation at hand. And so
mm,
it's like a weaponized weakness because of the system, because of society's valuing or prioritizing through implicit bias and actual societal indoctrination. I'm not saying people are consciously aware that they're doing this. I want to be very
right.
clear. It's
Right.
not conscious.
Yeah.
If it's conscious, it's not fragile,
Right.
it's
Right.
manipulative.
Right.
So it's not conscious fragility.
Mm,
Um, it's like I'm unconscious. I don't know how to handle this feeling, and I don't understand that what I'm doing is prioritizing my emotional overwhelm over the abuse at hand. But that is what's happening. And if
mm,
you're a person whose emotions emotional overwhelm comes out as anger, then you might start becoming defensive, saying that's not the case,
mm,
gaslighting, all kinds of things in an effort to not be seen as one of the bad ones or a racist.
mm, right.
And so there's if you couple that with this concept called aversive racism, which means that I can do and participate in things that might be racist as long as I don't allow myself to know better.
Mm,
And so the way I will say that I won't allow myself to know better is I will just deem me good. Like, no, I didn't do that because I'm a good person. And
Mm,
nobody's saying you're not a good person. We're saying everybody got the same programming.
right.
Black people, white people, and everybody in between gets the same US societal programming. So it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a programmed person.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are so averse to being labeled as a racist,
Mm-hmm.
complicit racist means you a complicit racist is one who participates in the structures without knowing. An overt racist is your KKK tiki torch driving a car into a protest, actively making laws to suppress
Mm-hmm.
people, like so voter suppression laws that are only
Yeah.
targeting African American communities. That is overt racism. I don't care
Right.
what they say. That's overt racism
Yeah.
because it's clearly like unless you just want to believe it's not, it's clear. We
Yeah.
use any
Yeah.
kind of objective reasoning. Um, but that when you don't want to be labeled as that, and you say and you make then what happens is you make the racism right in your defensiveness. Like so you
Mm,
justify it, and so then that makes you even you're becoming more racist instead of less.
right. Right. I see so many parallels with this with when abuse survivors disclose abuse. There will be people who, instead of taking care of the sexual abuse survivor, domestic violence survivor, whatever the case may be, they will be like, oh my gosh, I can't handle this. And, they turn it into something about them. They feel guilty that they didn't know or do something better. And so instead of recognizing that and being like, wow, I had no idea this was happening under my nose. I didn't realize how I contributed. Let me learn, apologize, make active change. A lot of times people become defensive and, well, I was doing the right thing and, it wasn't me, it was, you should have known better. And, a lot of that defensiveness, or sometimes, I have seen where survivors will disclose and people close to them will, like you said, bring the tears on. And it's not necessarily that you can stop yourself from crying. Like, I don't think that's what either of us are saying, that you can't. Like,
Mm-mm.
sometimes tears just come out, but when you start making it about you, or making it about, well, it really is, whether you're like, I'm so sad, or whether it is about, actively being defensive. Like, either way, you're taking the spotlight off of the survivor that was hurt. And again, abuse, racism is abuse, and they're survivors in this moment. Yeah.
Yeah, your feelings in that situation, in the situation of being the abuser and then being sad about the abused feelings are more important than yours.
Mm-hmm.
They just are. They deserve more attention, more. If
Mm-hmm.
we were doing triage, it would be that you would do the abuse, you do them
Right.
in order of most importance,
Yeah.
right? Like, but if your comfort has
Mm-hmm.
already been a priority to you and you're taught
Mm-hmm.
societally that your comfort is prioritized, you expect people to tend to your emotions. You
Right.
expect people to react to how you feel. And that
Mm-hmm.
is actually that's a part of cultural programming.
Right.
Um, if you're having trouble with how much we're using implicit bias or the terminology programming, think about it as marketing.
Mm.
Marketing and branding works. If you hear it all the time, if you see it all the time, different images that you see make you feel things that make you want to. I can remember when I was a child, Calgon, take me away, for the overwhelmed parent to have a bubble bath and be able to escape their duties of house chores and having to work. And I'm 38 and I was probably 9 or something when that came out. And yet I still remember
Yeah.
Calgon Take Me Away
Yeah.
because that advertising was put in my mind so many times. So the imagery that you see, the news, the way the language is spoken on the news about Black people, the absence of imagery of Black people in previous time. Now we're doing pretty good with
Mm-hmm.
representation, but the absence of Black people in happy times,
Mm-hmm.
um, those are things that are programming your beliefs. And if you
Right.
don't believe your programming, your beliefs are being programming, and you are being programmed, then you don't believe in marketing.
Right. Yes, that's a really good way to put it. And um yeah, that's I've never thought of it as a way of marketing, but you're right. Like racism has been marketed in this country and ad dollars have gone to it. So like that's not even a a stretch. Like seriously. Yeah, that's a really powerful example there. Yeah, do we have time for one more question?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Well, this is one that we have brought up in our Facebook group. There has been a big discussion about this a couple months back. And really, this question was the one that helped us realize that Courage 365 really needs a multi part um, support system where we can learn and grow around the topic of race, from me as executive director to our board to our community in general. This conversation really was not not the first time we had thought about this conversation, but one where we realized we needed to take a step forward um, more quickly. And this is the conversation that came up in our group. And I'm just going to kind of read this little synopsis of kind of the conversations that were going on. So the question is about there were concerns in our Facebook group that were raised about Martin Luther King Jr. being accused of clergy sexual misconduct. And basically, for anybody who's not familiar with clergy sexual misconduct, it basically means clergy in a position of power using that power to coerce people under their power into sexual interactions, similar to a doctor coercing a patient or a therapist seducing a client. And the question, I think, really lies here with how might a survivor who maybe has gone through something like that, a person in power has taken advantage of them, how can a survivor look at allegations like this and sort out the difference between healthy skepticism of people with unchecked power and then also looking at our history and nation of how Black and brown men have really been targeted for false allegations, and Martin Luther King Jr. specifically. I mean, he was killed, assassinated, and so I was wondering if you could give us some of your thoughts on this topic. Um, I I'm really here to learn.
So it's a tough thing to discuss for me. But I definitely did preparation. I don't know if y'all see my shirt. It says I'm about making my ancestors proud.
Ooh, I love it.
Um,
That's great.
thank you. But so Martin Luther King definitely participated in adultery. And also, he is a great hero of the civil rights movement and a champion for causes that I believe in for obvious reasons.
Right.
However, so J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had an obvious, espoused outward vendetta against Martin Luther King and all the leaders of the civil rights movement.
Right.
And the article that was written, I believe Grover is the author's name, or Groover, and he wrote it, and it was based on his allegation of the misconduct. Now, sexual deviancy is what was written, but you got to think of the timing. Sexual deviancy in the 60s could be like certain sexual acts, even though they were consensual,
Right.
were considered sexual deviancy.
Oral sex is actually illegal in Virginia last time I checked, even today. So there was a lot
Which
of sexual deviancy could mean a lot of things. Yeah.
remind me not to visit Virginia, but
I don't know if it's enforced. I haven't seen it enforced.
but but so there's context is what I'm saying, and I know that J. Edgar Hoover had a vendetta, and I know several black, like there's no prominent black civil rights leader that hasn't been investigated by the FBI, like not one, like
Right.
an active pursuit with bias investigations. And yet the Klan, anyway, the white counterpart, not even counterparts, white actual terrorist organizations do not get scrutinized with that same light. Why? Because the people who are in position have been in position for a while and might have been in position the whole 57 years since Jim Crow was abolished. But all of that plays into how we really cannot know. And the tapes themselves, where the notes were written that the author wrote the article about, won't be available or declassified until 2027.
Mm.
I know that they played those tapes though for his wife and sent him messages asking him to kill himself or be publicly shamed.
Mm.
Um, so where I stand on it is I don't think he was a rapist. If he was an abusive man in like the abusive power sexual way, and when I say this whoop-de-doo, I don't mean it to minimize the abuse that people experience, but that's a dime a dozen. Men in power who abuse their sexual privileges is not abnormal. So it's
Interesting.
kind
He's
of
being
like,
targeted specifically when other people with more power and more destruction. Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
I mean, I voted for him, but Bill Clinton was elected twice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The second to after the impeachment for oral sex. Um, and that's an abuse of power. I mean, I'm black, so living with abuse and certain forms of abuse might be more like too indoctrinated. But if I have to take a civil rights leader, like, so if I'm list of abusive people that exist in my awareness, the kind I will take is one who's going to get laws enacted to create civil rights for black people.
Mm.
Um, I struggle, like Bill Cosby's a whole rapist, but I have nostalgic feelings about the Cosby Show because it gave me different imagery
Mm-hmm.
for black people. But
Right.
do I respect Bill Cosby as a man? No.
Right.
Do I value the contribution that Bill Cosby did with his art and his creation to black culture? Yes. Am I so saddened and disheartened by that disconnect? Yes. But I remember both.
Right.
And so, should we find this to be true, it's appropriate to me to remember both and to then remember that this is a person in history and the work to be done for you and your abuse prevention
Mm.
is not to be constantly obsessing over ways like you can't, if you stay obsessed over your trauma, you're stuck in it. So healthy skepticism, learn what you need to look for in your environments
Mm.
and things that are not your fight. Don't let like if it can't be this can't even be proven, so it doesn't need to be brought up now unless it's one of the survivors bringing it up
Right.
because that's also their stories to tell.
Right. And I think that's really important. So many things you hit on there. Number one, he was being attacked and ultimately was killed. There were a lot of things that our government did to discredit him. And, aside from Martin Luther King Jr., the CIA, the FBI, they've done some really bad stuff. And I'm not telling you to look at conspiracy theory websites, but legitimately, if you look at the CIA website and you look about things around MK Ultra and other things that they did, Project Paperclip.
COINTELPRO was a
Mm,
program to fund the Nicaraguan war, flooded crack into the communities.
exactly. So when we're hearing allegations against a man who changed history for people of color and just people in general, we have to also remember the people who are trying to discredit him. And like you said, Alexis, we don't have the proof. The documents haven't been fully released to the public, and we don't have a survivor speaking up about it. And so We can't
The
know.
author, all he had was a handwritten note on
Mhm.
the transcripts, and he went with that.
Right, exactly. So I know this is a touchy issue here in our community, but I think, and Alexis, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying is we can't know. Um, if it is found out to be true, then obviously we need to be aware of that. But that doesn't discount some of the good things that have happened. Bad people can do good things in any arena, and we don't even know that he is a bad person. That's something we can't know. And so putting all of our focus onto that instead of addressing the racism that we're seeing in our country today and addressing the survivors that are coming forward, it's not really a good use of our time and effort. Is that kind of the direction you're saying?
I that is what that's my opinion.
Yeah.
It's not a good use of your curiosity.
Mm-hmm.
And as an abuse survivor, for me, when I'm curious, I can feel the same as when I'm like skepticism and curiosity feel the same.
Mm,
And if I take on too much of that skepticism as a habit, then I'm
yeah.
navigating the world through my eyes of abuse
Yeah.
instead of through the eyes of my healing.
Mm, mm. Thank you for that. Wow. Wow. Well,
So
this.
yeah, if you're not going to heal, you're ruminating, you're re-triggering.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. And thank you for being vulnerable, and sharing, your experience as a survivor, your experience as a Black woman in America. We are just so, so grateful for you and your work. And before we talk about where people can find more about you and your work, I want to jump to a quick commercial here about one of your programs that's in the midst of creation. And we're just going to jump over here for everybody to see that for a second. Always stay dreaming, never imagined I lose my spark. Living in this crazy time, putting back the pieces of my mind. I know how to run from the dark and fly. Feel my wings spread, levitate into the clouds. I'm so high above the ground. I'm rising. I'm soaring above it. It all. I just wanna be free. Finally, I wanna be free. I wanna be free. I wanna be free. Thank you so much for that. I know everybody's going to want to check out that program. And before we get into sharing all of your social media, and where people can follow you, because you've got a YouTube channel, you're active on Facebook and Instagram, um, is there any final thoughts that you want to share about this discussion?
I just want to remind people to keep having it.
Mm,
Um, excuse me. What has happened many times in our history's iteration of having this exact same discussion is that we all get tired,
mm,
and then it takes some tragic event or some uprising or some rebellion some commotion, some protest to bring it into the conversation. But
right.
if you're really tired of talking about race, you just got to go through talking about race and changing things.
Mm,
Because
yeah.
if you what you do, you can't change what you don't acknowledge, and you can't heal what you don't reveal.
Mm,
Excuse me. So please do keep talking about race. I know it's uncomfortable, but I promise you, it gets easier the more you talk about it. And the more you talk about it, the more you understand where you actually are.
mm,
And then this last thing about white fragility. If you find yourself defending your position and you have not done anything to educate yourself on racism, and what I mean is, I'm not talking about opinions that you've read. I mean, you haven't done any actual research or been educated by a racism educator,
Mm,
chances are your opinion is unqualified and you're just making yourself look um, fragile at best, racist at
mm.
worst, and thick-headed or stupid pretty neutrally. Because you're making you're giving a, you know what I'm saying? People are loud and wrong, but you
Mhm.
didn't even check yourself to see if you were right.
Exactly. No, that's really good. That's really good. Um, yeah, thank you for that. And on the note of continuing the conversation, what I did with these questions for today, everybody listening, was I drew these from our Facebook community and some of the discussions that we've been having over the last few months. But what I would really love for you to do to help contribute to this conversation more directly is to submit your questions. And we are going to have a link below this video and tagged inside of the Facebook group so you can easily drop your questions about the intersection of a race and abuse, you know, being a white person, being a black or brown person. If you have questions for Alexis too, please feel free to share those. But we really want to have deep conversations like this. And this is your chance to begin this journey towards education for yourself. This is not the end of the road, but this is a step along the path and an easy way, honestly, for you to participate. And so I really encourage you to do that. Yes, we will
And
definitely.
Ashley made this free for you to participate. Like, I charge for these questions normally,
Mhm.
and Ashley paid that cost, right? Like, so there is, please take advantage of this opportunity. There's no question you can't ask, but give some thought to it. If it's something, if you're not curious about it, find some curiosity for it, because
Yeah,
that means chances are you're not doing anything to change it either.
yeah, yeah. That's a really good point. So where can everybody follow you in your work? You do a lot of beautiful things
Um,
online. Tell us, tell us.
Thank you. It is. I've been kind of mellow on my channels, but there's lots of great content on my YouTube channel, which is Ask Alexis 111, and on Twitter and Instagram is Ask Alexis 111, and Facebook I am I'm mostly on my personal page, which is Alexis Douglas, but it's public. And then it's Alexis Douglas, or my business page is Ask Alexis. So Ask Alexis everywhere, and I think even the Ask Alexis handle will take you to my personal Facebook page.
Nice. Nice. Yes. Yes, I love following Alexis's work. Her videos, Alexis, your videos, I enjoy them so much. They're so like raw and open and just you go there, you know? And so I
Thank you. Oh, I'm working on a new project. I bought
Woo!
actual video
Oh
cameras
my
for. I can't wait
gosh,
to.
that's
I don't
exciting.
want to tell you all about it, but it's gonna be. It's like I'm getting some stories, and I'm about making my ancestors proud.
I cannot wait. I cannot wait. Everybody, go ahead and follow Alexis. We will be sure to put all of those links below for you to do that. Don't forget to submit your question for our next conversation next month with Alexis. Thank you so, so much for being such a beautiful teacher in this conversation. Really, really appreciate you. Yeah.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And hey,
And
everybody, go ahead and check out our social media as well. If you're not already following us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, you can find us there. All of your likes and shares really help us get the word out to more people. And of course, you can go to courage365.org for all kinds of back episodes of the Courage Conversation Show. If you are in a situation where you need help, of course, if it's imminent danger or if you know or suspect child abuse, go ahead and contact the police. But for all other things, you can go over to courage365.org/need help and find a list of different resources that could be helpful to you in your situation. We also have a book called 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage that is free, our free gift to you. And when you sign up for that, you're also put on our mailing list where we tell you about the Courage conversations that are coming up. We tell you about the events we're hosting. We've got another one coming up in the fall, which I'm really excited to tell you about pretty soon. So, everybody, take care. Thank you so much for tuning into this conversation and live this week with courage. Bye.